Doug, these tensions are having a huge ripple across Palestinian communities, even within Israel, which is new.
It's interesting because we tend not to speak too much about what's called the Israeli Arab community within Israel itself. Within Israel, we're not talking about in the occupied territories or in the Gaza Strip. The Arab Israeli community, as such as that label is, many of those people self-identify as Palestinians. So you'll often hear about Palestinians in Israel. We've been hearing about protests in some cities, especially Lod in recent days. And when we're talking about those Palestinians in those Israeli cities, we're talking about the Israeli Arab community. Now, how much are we talking about? It's about, as of couple of years ago, it's 1.9 million people. It's about 20% or so, a little over, of Israel's total population. But a significant community, which at least on paper, Israeli Arabs are supposed to have equal rights with Israeli citizens. So they are, at least on paper, I keep adding that, have a very different status than Palestinians living in the occupied territories, either in the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip. The fact we're seeing protests in these Israeli Arab communities in some of these cities, most prominently Lod, which I just mentioned, which is a mixed Jewish and Arab city, is very significant. You rarely see that. Often these communities remain relatively, and you always have to use the word relatively in these conflicts, relatively calm when we see these outbreaks of eruptions of war, essentially, between Israel and what's been Hamas in the past few years. There have been 3 of these wars, essentially, in recent times between Israel and Hamas. And we haven't talked as much about the Israeli Arab community, but I would say keep your eye on those protests, because that internal strife, I guess you can call it, within Israel is also very worrying to Benjamin Netanyahu at a time where there's a political void in Israel. It's sort of the last thing he needed. He has enough other things to worry about on the military front right now to have to worry also about internal strife within Israel itself.
Doug, what about reaction from the United States? Joe Biden's a very different president from Donald Trump, and perhaps he no longer has Bibi's back.
Yeah, Joe Biden, Middle East was sort of in the back drawer for him. He, as we know, he has been heavily concentrated on other issues, his massive domestic agenda, Russia, China, pivoting towards Asia. His inbox is full. This is not what he wanted. This is not necessarily what he's prepared for. The U.S. is yet to even appoint and name a new ambassador to Israel. So this really came out of nowhere for him. Well, no, you can always sort of expect that something could go wrong, a tripwire in the Mideast. But he's right now left in a very awkward position. He's inherited a policy from Donald Trump, where Donald Trump showed nothing but absolute unstinting support for every move Benjamin Netanyahu made, right down to being the first president to actually recognize Jerusalem as the eternal capital of Israel, moving it from Tel Aviv. A lot of these policies, including that one so far, remain in place. Biden has reinitiated contact with the Palestinians, also reinitiated giving aid to Palestinian agencies and groups. But beyond that, a lot of Trump's policies remain in place, and the Biden administration has been caught a little bit on the back foot on this and is trying to play catch up. But what they have not done so far is there's no condemnation of Israel. They're playing it very safe, very cautious, although more progressive Democrats in the U.S., especially in Congress, have begun putting pressure on the Biden administration to speak out more against what they see as basically violations of international law by Israel.
Doug, thanks for that. France 24's Doug Herbert.